So it's a minute after 1. I think we should kick off. And I just want to say good afternoon to everybody and welcome to the CMSI Climate Justice Seminar Series. So I'm Associate Director of the CMSI, Coastal and Marine Sciences Institute, and I'm part of the organizing committee. Thanks very much for being here. We organized this Climate Justice Seminar Series to give all of us as scientists the opportunity to think more deeply about our role in climate justice and more broadly in environmental justice through a series of seminars and interactions. Today we're hearing from Dr. Hilda Jorrens, and who will be introduced shortly by my colleague and PhD candidate, Karina Fish. We are recording this seminar. I think everybody knows that, for your information. And for the questions, there's a Q&A box. That's where you should put your questions. Not in the chat because they won't show up there. This seminar series has been supported also in addition to the CMSI by CIMEC, which is a cooperative institute for marine ecosystems and climate, which is a NOAA UC cooperative institute. Actually, it's just come to an end, and the new one, CMES, has just started. So this is the swan song of that cooperative institute. And with that, I think, Karina, I'll pass this on over to you. And just to thank everybody again for coming.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Again, my name is Karina, and it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Jorrens. She is an associate professor at the University of Rhode Island, where she is a cultural anthropologist and decolonial scholar. The thread that binds Dr. Jorrens' scholarship is understanding how racial and gender inequality manifests itself in cultural production, nation building, access to environmental resources, and exposure to environmental degradation. Dr. Jorrens' research has been centrally concerned with critiquing structural inequalities and dismantling taken for granted notions of power. At URI, she teaches core courses in anthropology, such as anthropological theory, language and culture, anthropological approaches to the study of Latinas, Latinos, and Latinxes, and gender and culture, among others. And she's newly a children's book author as well. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Jorrens to our Coastal and Marine Sciences Institute's Climate Justice Seminar Series.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. I want to first, before I get going, share my screen. And I want to make sure that can you all see my screen? Is it showing up? Okay, I hope it is. So I just want to thank Karina Fish for the introduction and for inviting me here today, as well as John Largier and Jessica Ramos, who is working hard behind the scenes to make this event happen, and to all the organizers at the UC Davis Coastal Marine Science Institute, as well as the sponsors for this event. So I'm really thankful to be here and for the opportunity to share my work with you. So this presentation I've titled Fighting for the Right to a Safe Environment in Puerto Rico's Jobos Bay. And Puerto Rico's Jobos Bay, as I'm gonna show you here, is in southeast Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico, as you all know, is an archipelago, right? Puerto Rico is the larger island, the larger of the 3 islands that are inhabited. So the Jobos Bay is in the larger island named Puerto Rico. And of course, there's Vieques and Culebra, who are both of which are offshore municipalities. And Puerto Rico has, of course, hundreds of uninhabited keys as well that form part of this archipelago. So briefly, also, my family is from Puerto Rico's southeast. And so in my work, I do a lot of auto-theory and life thinking, which is a method and a theoretical framework, right? That allows me really to use my family's experience to offer a counter discourse and counter narrative, right? To the official history that is told about people like my family who are Afro descendants, who were brought right to the shores of Puerto Rico to toil in the sugarcane plantations, mostly as enslaved Africans, and right, who we mixed with Spanish settlers later, and that forms our identity and who we are today. But this out of theory and life thinking, right, is a method that has been practiced by Latinx, Indigenous, feminist and queer scholars and Black feminist scholars, to account, right, for biography and embodiment, and how bodily experience really also should be a part of our thinking, or social science thinking, or social criticism and our research. And so I just wanted to share that aside from doing this research in the Hobos Bay, my family also, my mother's family, my maternal family also hails from this region. And this is a picture of my mom and her siblings here. Before I also get going, I want to share that a lot of what I'm sharing here, or at least a piece of it, actually, not a lot of it, but a piece of it will be in, you can read it, and of course a much more expanded version in my forthcoming book called Making Livable Worlds, Afro-Puerto Rican Women Building Environmental Justice, which details the work I've been doing on environmental justice in Puerto Rico's Southeast. Since 2015, I began doing this work, this particular work there in 2015, though I've worked in the Southeast of Puerto Rico my entire career, which began formally in 1998. Additionally, just today, our children's book, a bilingual children's book that I co-wrote with a colleague, Dr. Catalina Dionis, and a local youth from the Hobos Bay, Mabel Colon, who was actually also the illustrator of this book, and Khalil Garcia Llorens, who's another youth who happens to be my son. We co-wrote collectively a bilingual children's book telling the story the story of environmental justice in the Hobos Bay, and it's free for download. I can share the website for where you can download this book in the chat box, or in the Q&A, one of those boxes at the end of this presentation, if you're interested. So a brief historical conceptual timeline of the time, of this kind of history that I'm going to take you through here in a very abbreviated way. But the region, the Southeast, the Southeast Puerto Rico, is a region that was established, right, upon conquest, upon colonization, right? The Taínos who lived there were quickly, apparently, and this is right, the main story is that they were exterminated, right? So that they became extinct. And of course, we never mentioned the word genocide, right? But this is really what happened in Puerto Rico. It's a story of indigenous genocide, and then the replacement of Taíno people with settler Spanish, and of course, enslaved Africans at the beginning, and then free Africans throughout the centuries. Puerto Rico, of course, always had more freed people of color than enslaved Africans. But in this particular region of Puerto Rico, in the Southeast, there was a great deal of enslaved Africans, because this region was a sugar plantation region. So the area was devoted to sugar cultivation, okay? So it is a region, unlike other parts of Puerto Rico, in which the culture of the plantation is really still very present. And I'm gonna show you what that looks like in terms of, 20th and 21st century. In the 20th and 21st century reality, what that, the plantation looks like from the 17th century to now. In the mid 20th century, Puerto Rico goes through a process of industrialization, right? And of course, the idea was that Puerto Rico, through this process of industrialization, Puerto Rico would become part of the modern world, right? It would become a player in the modern global economy. And this, at this point, the mid 20th century really introduces what we're still dealing with today, which is this highly contaminated fossil fuel dependent toxic environments that communities in the Southeast are dealing with now. And then if we have time at the end, I can talk a little bit about ecological resistance, and then what kinds of coastal futures will produce good lives and higher well-being for residents in this region. In environmental and climate justice circles, particularly in the global north, we have grown accustomed to hearing and repeating the clarion call that the only viable future is one that is fossil-free. So in light of the continued global dependence on fossil fuels, mainly diesel, oil, coal, and increasingly methane, also known as natural gas, to produce electricity, a worthy question is, which populations can expect to live in a fossil-free and environmentally just future? In a safe environment, which is the title of this talk, right? The right to a safe environment. A safe environment is one that is not destructive to human health, is safe from contamination and pollution, and allows for the attainment of adequate health and well-being. Now, the Hobos Bay region, which I show you in the other map, and this is a close-up map, I have called it an environmental injustice hotspot or a sacrifice zone because it is a region that is heavily loaded with contaminating industries. And this is, as I mentioned before, was a region that went from being a plantation region to then turning into this, right, because it is in a hinterland, it's far away from the San Juan metropolitan region, turning into this kind of the place where the electricity would be produced in Puerto Rico, but not only electricity, and I'm mainly going to focus on the electricity complexes located there now and causing a great deal of suffering in these communities. But also there were pharmaceutical companies, some of them are still there, recycling companies, military installations. So there's a training Camp Santiago, that is still active in this area, and there's detonations, right, of military weapons and things like that. So this is a really, really heavily loaded area. There was also a oil refinery that actually was a Superfund site that was closed in the early 90s, and the cleanup of it was just completed, supposedly was just completed recently. The Superfund site case has been now closed. And so this is a highly loaded region here with contamination. Now, this region has a poverty index upwards of 50%, and the people who live here, at least 28% in the earlier data, the new census data is actually due out, the race data, so this might change these figures, the figures I'm giving you here, but it is an area that is highly where the people highly identify as Black or Afro-descendant. Is actually one of the highest concentrations of Black identifying individuals in all of Puerto Rico. And of course, this has to do with the plantation culture that still remains in this region. And that really, it's part of the identity of the region. So here, briefly, I'll show you the ruins of the Aguirre Sugar Mill, which is right in the Hobos Bay. And this is the Aguirre Sugar Mill was the last sugar mill it shuttered in 1990, the Aguirre Sugar Mill did. So it was the last mill of all the mills that were in this region to shutter. What happened when this mill closed its doors is that, it was really catastrophic for the people in this region, particularly, right, the men who were head of households, because they lost their jobs, not only in the mill, but the sugar cutting jobs out of the mill, right, in the fields. And so this region is one that has dealt with catastrophic blows of the global economy and the ebbs and flows of the global economy for a lot longer than other regions in Puerto Rico, right? Because, already by the 1974, the first sugar mill closes, then 1978, the next one. And this one kind of, limped along until 1990, when it was clear that sugar was not going to, Puerto Rico sugar was not going to get very good prices in the world market, and it shuttered, sending thousands of people into unemployment, and of course into migration, which of course migration from this region has been very high throughout the 20th century, out migration into particularly to the northeast of the United States. And so this is in the same place, in the same neighborhood as the Aguirre Sugar Mill. This is the Aguirre Power Complex. This is functioning today. This is a double engine power complex. So these two towers each are one, are one engine each. This complex produces about 40% of Puerto Rico's electricity. So actually, many times when you hear that there's a power outage in Puerto Rico, a large power outage, this is the power complex that is affected. Oftentimes, this is the place where there's an issue, then 40% of Puerto Rico loses power. So this, as I said, is a neighbor of the Aguirre Sugar Mill. The ruins are still there. One of the things to know is that this particular neighborhood, the Aguirre neighborhood, where you have the ruins of the sugar mill and you have this bunker, this power plant that is actually powered with bunker C oil and diesel. This is also a fishing village. And this neighborhood used to be a segregated company town. It used to be the company town of the Aguirre, actually the Aguirre Sugar Mill. And it was a segregated company town. So the workers lived here, and the poor workers lived adjacent to the bay, and then the managerial class of the sugar mill lived away from the bay, inwards, right, towards, away from the water and towards the mountains. And so what happened here is, and the reason that the geographically, the spatial layout is the way it is, and still today the workers, the descendants of the sugar workers, live closer to the water and in the mangroves, is that the mangroves and the waters were seen as full of mosquitoes, as areas where managerial class didn't want to live because there was just too many, it was too hot, too swampy, too many mosquitoes. And so they moved away and left the workers to live in the bay. Of course, the workers, many of them became also fishers. And this is also a fishing village, as I mentioned. And one of the issues that the fishers face in this community is that because this power plant is here producing contamination, not only in the air, right, but also in the water, because what happens is this power plant sucks up cool water from the bay to cool its turbines, and then puts out hot water into the bay. So in order to get any good fish, right, the fishers have to go further and further out into the sea in order to fish, to have a good catch. Also here, and I'll show you what it looks like here. This community, of course, is one of the most, in fact, I think it has Puerto Rico's dirtiest air. Is one of the most affected communities in terms of asthma rates, cancer rates, hearing loss, because the sounds from the power complex are very loud. So people report hearing loss, migraines, skin rashes, right? So it's a community that is very sick as a result of these energy producing complexes. And there are three, which I'm gonna, so Aguirre is a double complex, and then there is the power plant, which I'm going to show you in a second. Also in Aguirre, and this is, so here, I'm sorry, here's the Aguirre Sugar Mill and the Aguirre Power Complex. They're basically neighbors. They're in the exact same community, and people live in between these two. There are, houses in which people live, mostly descendants of sugarcane workers who inherited these humble houses and still live in this community today. Here is an aerial shot, which I wanted to show you because we're now going to move across the bay. But one of the things to know, so here, the Aguirre Power Complex, this is where we were just now, right? This is where the sugar mill is and where the diesel and bunker C oil electric company is located, producing, right, a staggering amount of Puerto Rico's energy. And then here in this circle is actually the Hobos Bay National Estuary Research Center. And this is important because this is a federal reserve and it's a protected area. And of course, across from it, right, flanked, this reserve is flanked by the Aguirre Power Complex on one side, and then the ASE coal power plant on the other side. And the ASE coal plant produces electricity from coal, which I'll talk about in a second. Now, this Federal Reserve is Puerto Rico's, it's important, right? Because this bay here is Puerto Rico's second most significant estuary. What that means is that this is an estuary with a lot of life. This is an estuary in which, right, this is actually a photo from the estuary, in which there are manatees, turtles, migrating birds that come here and come through here. There's salt flats. This is a mangrove wetland area, so lots of fish, right? This is a fish nursery, of course, land crabs. So this is a really significant estuary in terms of life, in terms of, hosting life for non-human animals, as well as, of course, communities. And so I wanted to mention that this place is significant not only in terms of the people who live here, but also the non-human animals who also dwell here and who are part and parcel of the ecosystem, and who maintain and give back to this ecosystem, and with whom people have relationships with, right? People have relationships with these these relatives, as I like to say. So here is a photo of the coal ash, which is produced by the coal power plant located on the other side of the Hobos Bay. And so this is really a problematic source of pollution for the communities and for the ecosystem. And so not only are communities dealing with, high air contamination from the emissions, right, from the diesel power plant, but also they're dealing with the coal combustion residuals produced by the toxic coal ash here at the AES private power plant. One thing to know is that the Aguirre Power company is a PREPA, or it's a public utility plant, right? So it's not privately owned, it's owned by the people of Puerto Rico. It is about $8 billion in debt at the moment. And so there are talks, and in fact, increasingly, it looks like it's going to happen. There are talks to privatize Puerto Rico's public utility. And there's a company called Luma Energy who seems to be in the running to obtain the contract, which is really problematic for many reasons. But this one, the ASE toxic, this is the mountain of coal ash produced by the AES power plant. This is left out, right? This coal ash is left out to the elements on the facility, right, in the area where the plant is. So the plant is right here, and what they do is they put the waste, the coal waste on one side, and then the unburned coal on another, and it's all left out to the elements, right? So when the wind blows, this thing blows around. When it floods, right, this all seeps into the water, and it's already seeped into the water, and this aquifer is contaminated, and the aquifer for this region, for Puerto Rico Southeast, offers fresh water to about 100,000 people in this region. And so 100,000 people are not really having access to clean water at this very moment, because the aquifer has been contaminated by the leaching of heavy metals from this toxic coal ash mountain. The cancer rates are staggering. I spoke to the medical director of the last hospital that is still open and operating in this region. And he said that since this plant opened in 2002, he has noted about a 70% increase in cancers in this region. Now, this is, of course, a problem on its own, but it's an additional problem when we have to remember that because of the austerity measures placed in place in Puerto Rico, and because of the economic difficulties that the island, has experienced since 2008, actually since 2006, but then aggravated in 2008. The hospitals, there were 3 hospitals in this region, and 2 have shuttered, and there's only 1 hospital to service the people in this region, and this is a region that in which over 100,000 people live. And again, just like the aquifer, right? The resources are stretched very thin for people who are experiencing a great deal of illness as a result of living in this burdened community, in this burdened region of the country. So coal ash waste is one of the largest waste streams generated in the United States, right? In the continental United States. In Puerto Rico, this plant generates around 3,000 tons per year of toxic coal ash. And this is important, again, because this, the only way really to get rid of this contaminating material is to shut down the plant and not produce it at all, right? This plant actually produces about 18% of Puerto Rico's energy. Studies have shown that Puerto Rico doesn't really need this extra energy, that there are several other plants producing enough energy to cover the needs of the island. So what's interesting with this plant is that it opened in 2002 when in the global north, coal plants were closing down. So this is emblematic of the ways in which these companies operate, right? So that as the global north is getting rid of its coal plants, what happens is they begin to open coal plants in the global south, right? And Puerto Rico received this coal plant. And one of the excuses, right, for why the island, the archipelago needed this coal plant was that private industries are more efficient, more reliable, and that this particular private entity would then produce energy for the tourist market in San Juan. So the lines, this is important in southern Puerto Rico. Both of these plants really produce energy for the north, for Puerto Rico's north, right? And in the north, when I'm talking about south versus north, what I'm saying is the south is a hinterland that is burdened with all of this pollution that pays the price, right, to give energy and to satisfy the high energy demand in Puerto Rico's north. And the north is the San Juan metropolitan region, right? The city where a lot of the tourism is taking place, right? So this plant particularly, right, the reason that they thought it would be a good idea to open this coal plant in Puerto Rico's southern region, it was to give energy and to satisfy the energy demand of the tourists. And as we know, tourism is a really, really energy hungry sector, right? So, and I always, when I talk about this with my students, I say, you have to remember when people from the north travel down to, the Caribbean, go to the Caribbean, right? It's balmy, it's warm. It never really cools off. There is no cool off period. The temperature pretty much remains steady throughout the day, right? But people, if you go from the north to the south, you're gonna feel the heat of the tropic is going to work on you differently. And so people often, in their hotel rooms will leave on the AC, right? As they go for 8 hours on tours or to the beach, the AC is pumping out air for 8 hours to cool rooms, right? People will leave on the televisions. People live on the lights running, right? All of this is being paid for by people in these communities. So in these communities, people are paying for this energy with their health, right? And not really getting any benefits from it because these entities don't employ community people. Rarely do they have employees who are from these communities, right? when energy goes, right, they are some of the last people to receive energy back again, right, when there's outages. So they pay with their health, but they really don't receive any benefits from having these contaminating entities in their communities. So this is what it looks like from the bay. So standing in one of the bays where people, as you can see, are swimming and enjoying the 4th of July, which was that, you know, the 4th of July in Puerto Rico is also a holiday in which people celebrate, right, the independence of the United States. Since Puerto Rico is a colonial territory, it's also a day off for workers and such. So here, I took this photo on the 4th of July, and when I arrived here, right, there were families having a barbecue, people, you know, fishing, people enjoying, right, their day off, children bathing. And of course, this is all happening in a bay where the toxic coal ash is right there, you know, open to the elements, open to the air and the water, and a bay that we know is suffering from the contamination wrought by these AES coal power plants, right? And of course, again, when I spoke to the medical director at the local hospital, you know, one of the things he really wanted me to know was that after this company opened, cancers, right, as I said before, but also, you know, he said skin rashes, asthma, renal diseases just skyrocketed, and people are much sicker as a result of having this power plant in their community. And of course, they're flanked by power plants on both sides, as well as other contaminating entities. So I'll just share with you what two community members told me when we spoke about environmental injustice in their community. So Carmen, a 61-year-old resident, said, "We have a right to live in a clean environment. Or is it because we are poor that we have to get used to being sick as a result of industrial contamination in our communities? Do we not have the same human rights as the wealthy and white people in this country?" And by wealthy and white, she's actually speaking about Puerto Rico's wealthy and white people. And then Sandra said, "What those companies will do is leave and leave behind all that contamination. They'll leave the air, the water, and the soil contaminated, and they'll leave us sick because we are nobodies. We don't have human rights because it seems that we are not people. In this country, only the rich people are human, and the politicians use us poor people to get votes, but when they are on top, it's like we are invisible. They don't even see the poor. They look past us." So these are two of the many statements, similar statements that I gathered throughout my years of speaking with community members in Puerto Rico's Southeast. There's this constant feeling, right, that which of course is not a feeling, is a reality, that they're not being seen, that they're not being heard, that they lack a right to a safe environment, that they lack human rights. And in fact, one of the things I argue in a forthcoming paper article is that not that yes to all of these things, but furthermore, that they're actually living in what Philip Alston, the rapporteur on human rights, called climate apartheid, right? The people in this region are living in a different environment than most people are in Puerto Rico. They're living in an environment that is in fact a version of the climate apartheid that Philip Alston said was forthcoming if we don't change the ways that we're doing business, the way we're producing energy, the way that we're relating, right, to our environment. Sorry, I went back. Okay. So the case of environmental injustice in the Hobos Bay is a clear example of a lack of distributive and participatory justice. So lacking distributive justice means that communities there in the Southeast contend with an unequal and historically heavy industrial load in comparison to the rest of the Puerto Rican territory. Additionally, the lack of recognition of these communities as being comprised in their majority by descendants of Africans, both enslaved and free, sugarcane workers, whose ecosystem is central to the identity and cultural practices of communities in this Black cultural zone. So they have no recognition of their cultural identity as being unique and important. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about that, about why that's important in a minute. The recognition by the state of the Afro-cultural identity of these communities could be one way to guarantee rights, access, and protection of their communities and ecology, right? So broadening the scope of what is protected in this region beyond, right, the non-human animals, right? The beyond that to really protect the Afro-cultural ecology and identity of communities in this region might be useful. The lack of access and often the plain denial of community participation in decisions that affect the community's ecology and quality of life point also to the devaluation of their knowledge, their cultural identity, and the local ecosystem by the government and multinational corporations cited there. So I want to move to talking very briefly, because I want to leave time for questions about ecological resistance. And when I'm talking about ecological resistance, and this is a concept that I think about in relation to my colleague, Dr. Carlos Garcia Quijano, with whom I work on currently actually working on a project on Black ecological knowledge in the Southeast. When we think of ecological resistance, we're thinking really about community stewardship and access, right? And to make sure that their access, that the community's access to coastal resources is maintained. Because without that access, the communities will be far worse off, okay? So ecological resistance is the way in which community members continue to engage with their coast, with the ecology, with the non-human animals, with the mangroves, in a way, right, that reminds everyone, right, that this is an area that is useful, that brings life, right, that brings well-being to these coastal communities. So in terms of ecological resistance, I'll talk very briefly about fishing, foraging, and gardening, and the ways in which, and food ways, and the ways in which mainly in this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about foraging, the ways in which foraging is really really significant and really constitutive of who the people in this region are, right, of their identity, and why that identity is worth preserving. One of the main engagements, so there's several ways in which people engage with their ecology. So I showed you earlier, right, children bathing in the bay, right? So that's a endeavor of leisure where people, go bathing, go swimming. People fish, of course. There's, this is a fishing region as well. But one other way, and this is something that Carlos Garcia Quijano and colleagues have documented throughout several projects actually funded by NOAA and Puerto Rico Sea Grant, and I've been a part of those projects, is this ecological practice of land crabbing. And this is part of a larger world called forest fishers. So in Spanish, it's called pescadores de monte. So forest fishing is actually this larger world of foraging in the mangrove and in the wetlands that wasn't really documented before Garcia Quijano began thinking about it, and then myself and other colleagues with whom we work. But the land crab is a really significant non-human animal that offers the community offers the community food and protein, right, just like fish, but also that really has a place in the community's ecological practices of ecological resistance. And this is something significant that I want to underline in this presentation. So yes, communities here are besieged by environmental injustice, and at the same time, right, communities here continue to practice their cultural practices that are life affirming, right? They continue to practice practices that bring them well-being and that give them meaning, not only in terms of their cultural identity, but meaning in terms terms of their, everyday lives. So one way in which the companies kind of also, how their policies and the ways in which they behave, aside from, of course, the incredible loads of contamination, but they also try to restrict access to some of the foraging grounds, right? So the AES power plant is situated on, as you saw, right there on a wetland next to the bay. And this used to be part of the foraging grounds of the communities. People in this area forage for land crabs all throughout this coast, including now the new location for the power plant. So here, the power plant here is also inflicting, right, environmental injustice on people's access to their ecosystem and to their foraging grounds. Here's another example, and these are, what I'm showing you here are folks who are forest fishers, who fish land crabs, and this is part of their livelihood. I should have mentioned that these are their traps that they use. There's several kinds of traps. This is traps that people make out of PVC. They're artisanal. They're made usually by the crabber themselves. And this is some of the crabs that they keep in cleaning stations, right? Because you can't just eat them. You have to clean them through a period of, a week to 2 weeks, and you feed them corn and bananas or mangoes, and coconuts are really important. One of the cleaning agents of the land crab is the coconut, and we'll talk about coconuts in a minute. But here's another land crabber, a community member. This man actually lives really in close proximity to the power plant. So one of the things that he told me is that he's constantly cleaning the surfaces of his house because all that ash is constantly blowing into his property. So he's going around cleaning his car and his house, the floors, even, the exterior, the plants, he says, are sometimes, when the wind is really strong, covered in coal ash. Another way in which people practice ecological resistance, of course, is by harvesting mangrove oysters. And here we have a father and a son who are both foragers of oysters, and mangrove oysters grow on the trunk of mangroves in the mangrove, in the wetlands. And one of the things, and this knowledge is really precious and important because harvesting mangrove oysters really requires dexterity, because the harvester has to be sure not to inflict damage upon the mangrove, because they don't want to kill the mangrove, which is the host of the oysters, right? So you want to harvest the oyster without inflicting any damage at all to the mangrove. And this man here also lives very close to the toxic coal ash, and also shared stories of having to clean the ash from his plants, from his car and his house, and from breathing in some of that stuff when the wind blows. He is somebody who learned his craft from his father, and then he's teaching it to his son, and they sell mangrove oysters on the side of the road, as you can see here. But all of these folks, the land crabbers, the mangrove oysters, the people who forage mangrove oysters are artisanal. They're doing this because they have deep ecological knowledge, not only of the ecosystem, but of the traditions, right? And how people want to consume both the crab and the mangrove oyster. So they have deep knowledge. This knowledge is passed down usually through families. And so again, this knowledge harks back to enslavement, when enslaved Africans had to fend for themselves to find food in this ecosystem, right? And then they, of course, became not only the most knowledgeable about the ecosystem, but also stewards of this ecosystem, right? So far from contributing to its destruction, they're actually the people who know the most about the ecosystem and who care enough about this ecosystem to really want to save it from ecocide. This another emblematic fruit crop of this area is the coconut, and this is a woman who is a coconut harvester. There's of course gender, when we think about food waste and we think about foraging, there's gender lines, right? So some things like coconut is something that women will sometimes, not always, but sometimes harvest, but they are the ones who really process the coconuts and use the coconuts in a variety of foods. This is an interview we were doing with a woman who had been harvesting and processing the coconut in her neighborhood. And she, of course, gave coconuts to her neighbors. So a big practice that people do here, a big thing that they do is that they gift food and fresh food to their neighbors, and that's a really big important big deal and important way in which people build and keep community in this area, right? And these are students who were interviewing this coconut harvester, students who were working with us in the field. And this is just the last image I want to show. And this is in an urban market in the San Juan metropolitan region. And this is in a neighborhood called Barrio Obrero. It's called literally workers' quarters or workers' barrio. And at this workers' barrio, there is this flea market in which, they sell used stuff. But also one of the things they sell are these hinterland black food stuff. So like coconuts are sold here, lots of hinterland foods that are used by Afro-Caribbean people in their food. And this man was processing coconuts in this urban neighborhood flea market. And I just wanted to show that and underscore, right, that this is a Black Afro-Caribbean region. And this is significant, right, because the environmental injustice is not just happening to Hispanics, as the federal government would have it, is happening to Afro-Latinos, right, within the territory of Puerto Rico. So it's happening to people who are a minority and who are already at a disadvantage in terms of the racial composition of the archipelago. So I want to end here because I think I'm out of time, but I just want to briefly say that the work I presented here, it's work that is possible as a result of conversations with community members, activists, and academic colleagues. And I just want to say that I am indebted to Ruth Santiago, Nelson Santos, Maben Colon Perez, Roberto Thomas, and my dear colleagues, Carlos Garcia Quijano and Dr. Catalina de Onis, who have been, partners really in this work that I've been doing. So that's it for now. And thank you for being here. And I'd be happy to answer questions if you have them.
Wow, thank you so much for that powerful talk. We do have a Q&A box for folks to submit questions. We have one already from an anonymous attendee who asks, since the US identifies Puerto Rico as a territory, has the government implemented any legislation for environmental injustice?
So yes, because Puerto Rico, as you said, as a colonial US territory, all the federal, the EPA mandates on EJ are all active and are supposed to be followed in Puerto Rico. So the same mandates and the same laws and the same the entire legal framework applies in Puerto Rico. And so activists such as I mentioned, Ruth Santiago, who is a community activist and environmental attorney. She is actually one of the really neat things that just happened, I believe last month, is that Ruth Santiago, who's one of my closest collaborators, and who is a member, right, lives in this community, works out of this community, and happens to, right, luckily be an environmental attorney who's a community member. She was named part of the WEJAC, the White House Environmental Justice Board, last month by Biden. So she's now, for the first time ever, Puerto Rican, an island Puerto Rican person, a person who lives in Puerto Rico and works there, is part of the Environmental Justice White House Advisory Council. So, and that's a big win, because it hopefully means that we can, right, bring these concerns closer to the center of power, because part of the issue with this region is that this region is what I call the periphery of the periphery. So if Puerto Rico is a periphery to the US, the southeast of Puerto Rico is a periphery to the metropolitan San Juan region, right? So this is really a region that is peripheral in every way. So having somebody right, from this region who is representing the environmental justice concern talking with folks at the White House is a really positive step forward.
Great, thank you so much. We have another question from another person who's wanting to remain anonymous, who says, what can you say of the role of Promesa over, I think they meant, in realistically bringing justice to these communities?
No, I can say that Promesa will not bring environmental justice to this or any community, right? Because the main goal of that legislation is to get the debt paid, right, for debt payment, and so they're mostly concerned with having the Puerto Rico people pay this staggering unpayable debt, and so they're really not concerned with environmental justice on the ground, particularly, right, because part of the big debt comes from the public utility, the energy sector, and energy sector is Puerto Rico's cash cow, actually. It turns out. And so they're really invested. In fact, it's the opposite, is they're really invested in privatizing the energy sector and in likely introducing methane or natural gas as they call it a bridge fuel, as the fuel that's going to power Puerto Rico to a fossil-free future in 2050 or something like that. But we know that this bridge fuel idea is bogus. Nobody needs, in a place with so much sun, nobody needs a bridge fuel. Methane has higher emissions even than coal, okay? And so people will say, oh, this is clean, it's clean fuel, it's natural gas. No, it is. The emissions and the impacts on communities are staggering. Okay, so Promesa is just not equipped to deal with the environmental, and then they're not interested. They're going to perpetuate environmental injustice. That's what they're doing. Yeah.
That is disheartening, but very realistic. Thanks. We have a question from Nicole Adams. Is there any coal mining in Puerto Rico? If not, how does the reliance on imported coal contribute to the injustice?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, because one of the concepts that we talk about, and when I say we, I'm talking about my colleague, Ruth Santiago, and Ruth and I talk about the coal death route. So route as a road, right? Coal is part of a death route. So from harvesting of coal to the burning of coal to the disposal of coal, what it does is it injures, right, and harms communities, right? So this is the only coal power plant in Puerto Rico. There is no coal mining in Puerto Rico. There's no coal in Puerto Rico. This coal actually comes from Colombia. And I had the opportunity to go to the mine in Colombia. And what I saw there was even more grotesque, in a level of injustice I've never seen before, right? And this is right, but this is typical of the mining. Anywhere where there's mining, the kind of, you cannot believe, sometimes it's hard to comprehend the realities of the level of injustice. So the coal comes from Colombia. In particular, there's 2 coal mines in Colombia. There's one in El Cesar, which is one of the Colombian states, and then there's one in La Guajira, which is the one I went to. And La Guajira is a region on Colombia's Caribbean coast. And the people who live here are indigenous Waju and Afro-Colombians. That's who live here, right? So immediately when we traveled there, we felt, right, a sense of kinship, particularly with the Afro-descendants in this region, because, right, if you're an Afro-descendant person, right, one of the things that we know, or that we should know and we should think about, is that we could have been brought there. So my family could have been offloaded in Colombia, not in Puerto Rico, right? So it was by sheer luck or whatever, I don't know, whatever, by sheer chance, not luck, chance, that we were offloaded in Puerto Rico, right? But we felt a kinship with the plight of the Afro-descendant communities in the coal mine region, because what happens is they have been displaced by the mine. So the mine goes in, surveys, if they find coal, they bring tractors and push everybody off their land that they have lived on for generations, their ancestral lands, and moves them off to urban centers. That is what, or offers them subpar land. And this is what has happened in Colombia to the Afro-descendant and Wayu indigenous communities. So they have been basically removed off their ancestral land to make way for the open mine pit, which actually is said to be the largest in the world, the one that this coal is coming from. So the death route goes from the extraction, right? And communities there are also very sick because coal extraction, actually, one of the things it does, it uses a lot of water and it contaminates the water. So and this is a desertic region, so they don't have water. Water is a big, it's like gold, right? Like finding water and clean water. And also asthma rates, right? So there's just a lot of, it's a staggering levels of injustice with these with coal and as well as with methane, with so-called natural gas, right? Fracking, right? The shipping and all of it entails injustice. Puerto Rico's coal is then one, I didn't talk about the waste, where the waste goes. One of the things I should just mention briefly is that there is no place to put Puerto Rico's waste. So it cannot be put in local landfills. That was a huge fight, and the communities won that to stop this waste from going into local landfills. But what that means is that this waste is then shipped out from Puerto Rico to communities in other places. So in a way, that's not a solution because, right, these other communities are being impacted by the coal, which of course then produces high cancer, asthma, right, death. And it usually is put in landfills adjacent to communities of color in the United States, by the way. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
We have about 6 more questions. We're short on time, so we're only going to ask a couple of them. Okay. There's going to be a two-parter, part from Isabel K and part from Hannah Palmer. Isabel K asks, are there foragers knowledgeable about the concentration of contaminants in the shellfish that are harvested and consumed in their communities? How do you balance supporting the cultural and ecological knowledge with the health implications of traditional consumption? And I'm going to pair that with Hannah Palmer's question of, can you speak to how you share the results of your work with community members that you work with?
Yeah, so both, I'll say, so the way we share the work, I'll start with that, is Carlos Garcia Quijano, Catalina Deonis, and myself, we're two anthropologists and a communication scholar who work together and alone, but work in this region. And what we've done is we collectively created this kind of support system for communities there. And so the three of us work really closely to give our data back to communities for different causes, different issues, such as, I know Carlos Garcia Quijano has given his coastal resource work to stop from, or to try to help cases that are trying of coastal gentrification. So his data has been used in court cases to try to show that this is a coast that is used by communities. So it isn't a wilderness or idle land. It's actually quite the opposite, to stop gentrification from happening. And so we're constantly in contact with community members. I publish a lot of my work with community members. And in fact, the children's book we just published is with a young woman who's highly affected by the coal ash. And in fact, her story is told in the children's book. And a lot of the work we're doing goes right back into community members and community organizations. And so our goal is really for our data to be used as a resource to stop both development, gentrification, but also injustice, right? In whatever way we can. And we're very adamant. So this isn't about producing knowledge, right? This is about really trying to stop this ecocide from taking place in this region to the extent that we can. And then in terms of the food consumption, yeah, there's a lot of awareness about contamination in this region. And in fact, some of the first people to notice contamination are the stewards themselves, the fishers and the foragers. There's a lot of times the people one of the people, and then mothers, right? The mothers are the other people who report contamination, who are the first to sound the alarm. So they are quite aware because they're in contact with this ecosystem day in and day out. This is, basically their brother, right? Their relative, their sister. They love this place. And so they're very aware. Now, all of the foods that they harvest here go through processes of cleansing, right? So the crabs are cleansed through the process of water. So they're fed water and then are fed mango and coconut and corn and things like that to cleanse them. And then the oysters are also cleansed through, solutions and waters and salts that they've created themselves. But they are very aware, and they're actually, when they sell it, it's funny because when you buy mangrove oysters on the side of the road, especially after the hurricane, right? Because the hurricane really, a lot of that coal ash went all over the place, right? The company denied that the coal ash moved from that, right, mountain. They said, oh, it didn't go anywhere. With 155-hour winds, it just remained in a pile. No, not true, right? So, but after the hurricane, a lot of the foragers were very concerned about letting people know that the food was safe to eat, that their oysters were clean. It was something that they were concerned about because this is also a livelihood. It's a petty livelihood, right? These people are people who don't have to migrate, right, in search for work because they know the ecosystem. They can, forage and sell food from the ecosystem. They don't have to work for companies that don't care about them or that only employ them part-time and things like that. So they're very, very aware of contamination, but also very careful to try to mitigate contamination in their product. Yeah.
I said, wonderful. There are still more questions, but we are past the hour mark. So I'm sure this conversation could go on for many hours, given the depth of your knowledge and your wisdom. I'm going to invite John to close us out, and please, everyone, help us thank Dr. Lorenz once again.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, really, just thank you once again, Dr. Lorenz. I think I speak for everybody. We learned a lot, and I'd love to continue the conversation, see ways that we can participate as in Puerto Rico, but many other places, and their challenges are not unique. Yeah. And thanks to everybody who joined today. Just a quick reminder that we have next in our series on the 24th of May, Dr. Kapuala Spurt from Hawaii, and there's more information on our website. So thanks everybody, and be well, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you again, bye-bye.